Welcome to Eclecticist. Eclecticist is an investigation of everything from a very British perspective by two brothers who consider themselves to be relatively normal chaps, and we do this one topic at a time. We are Benjamin de Campos, a designer and believer, Jeffrey Campos, an engineer and devil's advocate. We typically choose a topic of interest, something that interests us, and spend a little bit of time researching it, and then we have a discussion and publish the notes. We do this because we believe that it will foster a greater understanding of the world before we die, and hopefully it'll prompt further thought and discussion from our listeners. The topic we are tackling in this show will be climate change. It is a hostile universe. The near vacuum of space separates us by 25 trillion miles from our nearest star. In the 3.8 billion years of life on this planet, only 24 individuals, all of whom were human, have traveled beyond low Earth orbit. It is safe to say the world is all we know. It has provided everything we have ever needed to evolve and survive for eons. It is, however, a cooling rock prone to core and surface changes. Catastrophes have been known to happen. Armed with scientific methodology, we are now confirming our suspicion that it is human activity driving up global temperatures. Can anything be done? Is it too late? Or is it all a tissue of lies spun by vested interests and the media? Well, I think we need to know what climate change is. We've all heard this bandied about, and I constantly hear on a daily basis about climate change. So let's start with a definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. Climate change, it's a noun. It's an alteration in the regional or global climate, especially the change in global climate patterns, increasingly apparent from the mid to late 20th century onwards, and attributed largely to the increased levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide produced by the use of fossil fuels. Compare this with global warming. So, I think the general consensus from the scientific community would be that global temperatures are rising, slowly but noticeably, and one of the principal reasons for this is that the burning of fossil fuels has increased the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere, and that causes global warming by dint of the fact that it insulates the planet and keeps the heat in. I don't think this is very controversial, and I think if there is any controversy over this, it's mostly in the United States and the United Kingdom. I get the impression that this isn't particularly seen as a controversial statement from the scientific community in any other country, which seems a bit peculiar. But basically, everything is getting warmer, and this is going to be ferociously damaging for future generations in particular, and not so much for the immediate foreseeable future now. And that's climate change in a nutshell.
Why is
Do you believe climate change?
I do believe climate change, but why is climate change a bad thing?
Well, it's a bad thing because climate change is a significant, sustained change in a particular direction for a long period of time. So not just a year or a couple of days. You know, it's colder today than it was yesterday. Therefore, there is no global warming. You must take a much larger sample size in terms of time. And if you can see a trend, well, then extrapolate that trend, and then you can foresee the sorts of problems that may occur in the future. So if the planet gets significantly warmer, that will affect water levels, because it'll affect the temperatures available around the Earth where water freezes and water thaws, ice thaws.
The Polish ice cap.
So the Polish ice caps will be affected. The Arctic is affected, and that means more fresh water is coming into the oceans, and that affects the delicate balance of life and the general ecosystem and evapotranspiration and all the rest of it. Basically, it's a big, delicate Goldilocks zone that we are alive in and thrive in. And any significant threat to that is seen as a major problem, because we immediately think, is this something that we can adapt to? What's the fallout? Can we adapt? There are a lot of question marks. There are a lot of models that are used. In science, generally, models are used in order to try and make sense of measurement data. So all the sense data is there for a couple of 100 years in terms of temperatures. And when a vast collection of scientific research bureaus get together, get their brains together, and look at the data, it seems to be a consensus that things are hotting up. So, I mean, my personal experience, my personal account of weather related events through the media is that it seems as though the weather patterns are getting more erratic and more extreme rather than just everything's hotting up. But then I'm not a scientist and I don't read scientific papers all the time on the subject. So I defer to the scientific community to tell me what the facts are. But unfortunately, this is sort of filtered through the media, and the media have their own agenda. So I think this is one of our talking points. But it's good to be skeptical. I would say I'm a climate change skeptic insofar that I really want to be convinced and I want to understand the evidence. I want to see the evidence. I want to hear the case. I would like to hear opposing views, all in order that I get a better understanding of what's going on so I can make a more informed decision. So that's how I see skepticism of climate science and climate change. And I think there's a vast gulf of difference between skeptics and so-called deniers. I'm a skeptic, so I will change my opinion when better evidence comes in. I think that's the definition of a skeptic in this context. Whereas a denier, I feel, is somebody who is just simply refusing any new information and just point blank thinking along a particular line and is inflexible.
Yes.
That's a denier for me.
Yeah, you said earlier that it's not controversial, but it's a hugely controversial topic. Not the science. Honest and sincere scientists, come down on one side, and it's not controversial. It can't be controversial. Facts are facts, in as much as you take the evidence at face value. But you can find bent scientists with an agenda, and this is kind of what I want to talk about: the deniers, why they deny. Just reading around, the consensus is, of course, the climate is changing. But deniers exist despite masses of unambiguous evidence. And this is why I want to draw an analogy with those people for political or religious reasons or whatever will deny evolution.
Well, they're not necessarily rejecting the data, though.
Right. What do you mean?
They just twist their. They have an interpretation of the data. So the data will, if there's data there that suggests temperatures are rising, then a denier would say that, well, it's a cycle. So, the temperature is increasing, but then it will plummet according to a cycle, and we're probably more likely heading towards another ice age. And they play around with the amounts of time taken for the measurements.
But I want to get to the bottom of it. I want to know why that they're taking the stance there. Why are they being contrarian? And I'm sure there are people who are contrarian. But I think the majority is really interesting as to why they take this stance. Why they come to the debate already confirmed in their mind that this whole thing is a hoax. And denying evolution, there's this ideology which I find really, really fascinating. And with climate change, the ideology is a kind of anti-capitalist liberal plot or a socialist plot by people who believe there should be a small government and everyone has a right to be as successful as they possibly can be, and it's this liberal plot that puts these obstacles in their way, and part of this liberal plot is saying, oh, you have to be careful how much CO2s you dump into the atmosphere. We're going to restrict the amount of CO2s you dump in the atmosphere, and therefore standing in the way of economic growth. And so that's their starting point. And then any arguments for why they should be careful with how they treat the environment are discounted, and all these ideas are brought to the table about how the evidence is in question because they don't like where the evidence leads. Similar to the evolution deniers. What do you think about that?
Or the Holocaust deniers, even.
No,
I think
that's different. The reason why I put evolution deniers with the climate change deniers is they're both part of this strange American conservative package. It's a weird thing that I want to try and understand. A strange subscription to irrationality. If you deny evolution, you'll probably deny climate change is happening. You oppose abortion, gun ownership, taxes, that kind of thing. And they'll fervently oppose anything counter to this package of stuff, and they really aren't interested in what's actually going on.
I think a lot of people have drawn a line between a political line between, and this is perceived from either side, collectivist socialists and anti-statists.
Yes,
and the anti-statists always suspect a conspiracy on the part of the state, and that this is perfect for them because it allows them to start taxing heavily any kind of entrepreneurial capitalistic commercialism, and it's an attack on their freedoms because it's yet another constraint that they have to be cordoned in by.
Yes.
So I can understand that, this is not something we really want to think about. We want to think about our businesses. We want to think about our freedoms. We don't want to have to think about the environment, and because that's terrible, especially when it's something that's going to happen so far from now, and it's going to happen to different people. And I'm sure we'll think of something when we're at the precipice, because that's when change occurs.
Yes, I mean that's what I was saying. I mean, that's what it is. But it's just interesting just how, in my view, how sort of dishonest and unethical it is. And in being, and just sticking to that, I can draw an interesting analogy with what we've spoken about in other podcasts, which is the tobacco companies. How the rejection of all this mounting data that smoking causes cancer, addiction and tons of other things. Tobacco companies' dismissal of the science is, or they would claim that the science is not yet settled, therefore planting seed of doubt in the minds. And so they didn't need to make any changes to how they market their product, etc. I think the same thing for all these business owners and people who stand on that side of the fence, denying climate. They're lying so they can continue to poison the world for everyone.
But perhaps it's not just straight up all out lies. I think climate change is peculiar in that it's difficult to identify on a sort of almost cultural basis. It's hard to understand the magnitude and the implications of climate change and global warming. And I think perhaps at a and I hate this word, visceral level, perhaps we don't have the wiring to understand the gravity of the situation. And deniers are simply people who just are the leading expression of this fundamental incomprehensibility of the problem. I mean, we are the perpetrators, but we are also the victims. But we're not really the victims because future generations will be the victims. So to try and consider the effects of our actions today decades from now, I don't think is fundamentally part of human programming. So I think a lot of people will fall by the wayside when considering all of this.
No,
It's
I
just
wouldn't.
simply
I wouldn't give them the benefit of the doubt like that. I mean, that's very kind of you, but I just see it as just extremely selfish people who aren't interested in anything other than themselves. And caring about the environment would be caring for things that don't immediately affect them.
well, there are different types of denial, evidently. From a psychoanalytical approach, there are different forms. There's outright rejection. This is simply a psychotic denial where it's completely outrageous to even suggest this. There's absolutely no way we can have such an effect on the universe. There are universal laws that cannot be broken. It's just simply not possible that we can destroy our world, and I'm completely rejecting this straight off the bat without even looking at any of the evidence. There's suppression, which is I don't really want to think about it. It's too much for me to think about. I'm going to pretend it's not really happening, and I'm just going to go along and do what I do normally throughout the day and simply not think about the situation, totally ignoring the problem. Innerism. This is a phrase that was invented in the 70s in Brazil, apparently, when there were major political upheavals and people just didn't talk about the politics. They didn't want to know, and they just went and hid. They were innerists. Blame denial, so finding scapegoats. It's your fault, it's their fault, it's the Americans, it's capitalism, or not taking responsibility yourself and simply blaming others, and then you're falling into inaction. And then there's a sort of religious fatalism with a religious overtone, and that is we're doomed. There's nothing we can do. There's nothing really we should do. We're all going to die. We're going to a better place anyway. So this is just a staging ground, and so what if we burn up the planet? It doesn't really matter because there are better things ahead anyway. We don't need to do anything at all. So different stages of denial for this, which are all in the way and clouding the reality of the situation and stalling any sort of collective or collaborative effort to try and quell the issues.
Well, every one of those,
it's terrible.
Every one of those you mentioned is totally ignoble in my view. All of them promoting ignorance, and again, just a complete rejection of compassion for the future of the world. I mean, the religious one is particularly egregious, in my opinion. And that's something which I've been more and more interested in trying to get to the bottom of. Because it's like creationists, for example. Again, this whole denying evolution thing. It's like they take this weird stance against climate change. I occasionally listen to some right-of-center radio shows from religious organizations. And they often talk about climate change as being this hoax, and they have people on who claim to represent, some part of science somewhere, obviously some bent science, and they talk about it, and I'm trying to understand why. I mean, what is the religious component here? And it's like Ken Ham, for example. He hated that Noah film recently. And part of his dislike...
He's not alone.
Yeah. But part of his dislike was how he saw it as a kind of a film with an environmental message that he found just disgusting. And it's like, well, why? How could you think that? I mean, why?
Well, the earth is ours, and all that is in it. The animal kingdom is our dominion. We can do with them as we please.
Therefore, we shouldn't think twice about poisoning the planet. We shouldn't try and preserve.
No, we should, because we are stewards of God's creations. So, if anything in the Bible, we should take care of it.
Well, exactly. It's like, I mean...
But again, it's all open to interpretation.
Yeah.
So you remember,
could find two different arguments.
Religious... Yeah, well, the right-wing religious exponents are also anti-statists. They want to reduce the powers of the government, and they don't like any sort of consensual law building. So they're against it because they can see what's going to happen. They know that the only way we can motivate people to actually do something en masse is to have a government which sets decrees and therefore limitations on freedoms. But the payback is that we have a future. So it's probably a good idea. But I mean, when we think about denying, I mean, what are people denying? Is the science in? What is the science? What is the current state of the science as far as climate change is concerned? Now, there's an organization called the IPCC, and this is the leading climate change organization. It's the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. If you Google that in the UK, you will get the Independent Police Complaints Commission, but that's not the correct organization. And the IPCC, in 2014, they commissioned a serious review of the current state of the art in climate science. And it included the findings of hundreds of scientists, loads of scientific bodies and research bodies, regulatory bodies. It was absolutely vast, and they entitled it the 2014 Climate Change Synthesis Report Summary for Policymakers. So it's a report that tells anybody building policies when it comes to climate on what is actually driving their intentions. And the key conclusions from the report are, and I quote, "Human influence on the climate system is clear, and recent anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are the highest in history. Recent climate changes have had widespread impacts on human and natural systems." So they make no bones about it there. It absolutely is us. We are contributing to the increase in temperatures on the planet through a couple of hundred years of unremitting and increasing ejection of carbon dioxide molecules into the atmosphere. They also found that, and I quote, "Warning of the climate system is unequivocal, and since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. The atmosphere and ocean have warmed, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, and sea levels have risen." Again, fairly clear. These are the findings from the data, and the data just points at a direct correlation between the amount of fossil fuels that are pumped into the atmosphere and the amount of effects of global temperature that have been seen. And in fact, you can see the amount of carbon dioxide falls in line with the economic growth of the planet. So when there was a recession in the early 90s, you can see a dip in growth, and you can see a corresponding dip in the amount of carbon dioxide that was pumped into the atmosphere. The cause from the report was stated, and I quote, "Anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions have increased since the pre-industrial era, driven largely by economic and population growth, and are now higher than ever. This has led to atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide that are unprecedented in at least the last 800,000 years. Their effects, together with those of other anthropogenic drivers, have been detected throughout the climate system and are extremely likely to have been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century." So by anthropogenic, they mean humans. So human activity, especially fossil fuel burning, is the reason why we've seen such a remarkable increase in global temperatures over a very short span of time, just 100 years. So deniers often claim that 100 years just simply isn't enough to positively indicate our effects on the global climate and that we're on at the top of a cycle, or there are other reasons. But all of science seems pretty well agreed that we are having a significant effect on the world's weather systems. And to my mind, logically, if you're pumping trillions of tons of gases into the atmosphere, it absolutely will have an effect. And that effect seems to be significant. I mean, I couldn't possibly tell you if it's significant or not. I'm not too sure what the concentration of gases is in the entire planet, and the atmospheric shell perhaps is a ludicrously large number of square kilometers. Maybe it's just a drop in the ocean, so to speak. But it certainly seems obvious that we're going to have an effect, whatever that effect is, and however ferocious that effect is. But the science seems completely agreed. There's all scientists, unless you misquote them or take their quotations out of context, they are agreed that this is actually happening. No controversy.
Yes. Well, I mean, that the passages you just read, I mean, sound totally reasonable to me, and I think anyone who's not an a-hole will agree with that, and will be completely convinced by the evidence. And it's interesting because it kind of reminds me of a notorious creationist or infamous Kent Hovind. You know, he had this thing where he would give like $250,000 to anyone who offered evidence of evolution. And obviously, there's no way anyone could win that because he's constantly shifting the goalposts or whatever. But in one of his debates, some guy stood up with a huge mass of evidence and said, you know, here's everything that will, you know, that is convincing to any reasonable person that evolution is a fact. And Hovind goes, "That's not evidence. That's just a whole bunch of papers." And I think, by you know, reading all this very convincing data from scientists and stuff, it's just for so many people, because they have an agenda. It just goes in one ear and out the other. You just can't. There's nothing.
Who has the agenda? The scientists or the people who are
the scientists are part of this government conspiracy, this liberal plot, this socialist plot, this anti-capitalist movement to restrict the rights of businesses. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter what the evidence says. You know, people will just dig their heels in and just won't be moved.
And until we are at the precipice, as I've said.
Well, that's true.
You know, we have
or
lava flowing in Los Angeles.
In the way it works with so many of these people, unless something affects them personally, then suddenly they'll change their minds, because they just don't have any kind of empathy to imagine a situation otherwise.
Yeah, this goes back to my comments earlier about we just simply don't have the brain wiring to understand fully the implications of what we are now doing, what we are now perpetrating, and how dire those implications are. I mean, you know, we're all breathing out of the same oxygen cylinder, and we're poisoning that oxygen cylinder. So sooner or later, we're going to be reaping the whirlwind. So, you know, it's a terrible situation.
I was just reading a list. I'll put this in the show notes. This list of people that this website believes are standing in the way of making real changes to how the world works when it comes to climate change. You know, so people like the Koch brothers and Rupert Murdoch and various other
big oil.
Yeah, big oil. And what's interesting is that I've been looking into this recently, and we could get off oil. You know, that is a reality if we just pull together in the right direction to do so.
Could we, though?
Well, you sound like you have a story.
Well, I think in terms of energy production, you know, all of the cars that we see on the roads certainly could be electric. And the electricity could be generated by nuclear power stations for sure, which are a sort of fossil fuel, utilizing energy production system because it's using a fossil fuel that's in limited supply, uranium. But even so, it would be a lot cleaner than burning fossil fuels in order to boil water in order to produce electricity for all the cars on the roads. That's a start for energy production. But of course, there's oil in manufacturing. Oil in manufacturing is irreplaceable.
Why'd you say
what
that?
else are you going to use? Because how else are you going to make plastics? How else are you going to make fertilizers and you know, everything else that requires development of and fractionation of the crude oil that comes out of the ground? Half of all crude oil is used in manufacturing and not in energy production. There's a lot less burning required, obviously, so it's still a lot cleaner than the other 50%. But even so,
but I've heard some very convincing arguments that it is possible. And you saying,
I'm
oil
sure
and
it's possible. I'm sure
manufacturing.
it's possible.
Yeah, this is what I'm
I'm sure it's
saying.
possible, but it's not just energy production we're talking about here. If we wanted to get off of fossil fuels,
No, I know.
it's
I
also
know it isn't.
manufacturing.
You sound like that guy in that documentary, the guy who's chain smoking and talking about a bunch of crap. But I now think that he might actually be part of this conspiracy of arseholes. And I've heard various other, or I've read various other things that make me think that it is actually a possibility getting off fossil fuels for manufacturing. I mean, this is possibly a topic for another show. This might be straying too far away from the topic of this one, but it's a real possibility. It can be done, I believe.
I'm with you. I think it absolutely is possible. I think anything's possible,
Right.
within reason, and I think it's going to have to happen.
Yes.
Because you can't continue to use a limited quantity resource in order to provide you with all of the necessary and luxurious items that we enjoy today as humans. It's going to happen. I think it's already happening. I mean, we're pushing the burning of oil. Cars contribute an awful lot of gases into the atmosphere. It's amazing. It really is amazing. Cubic kilometers of carbon dioxide are produced out of every single car. And there's a real pressure on the car industry, probably just commercial pressures, on car manufacturers to reduce the amount of pollution that's coming out of the back of the cars. And they're certainly going down. When you buy a new car today, it's considerably less CO2s coming out of the exhaust pipe than it was a couple of years ago. And of course, we have the electric cars, which at point of use are not producing any toxic gases into the atmosphere. But of course, you could argue that they're just simply pushing that CO2 back to the power station. So it depends on how filthy that electricity is in the first place. But efforts are being made, and I think a lot of the effort is commercial. The market economy is aware that consumers are becoming more aware of the environment. There are fewer deniers, and there are less strenuous denial now that the evidence is mounting to a point where it's undeniable. So, efforts are being made for sure, but really, it's a big planet, and there are an awful lot of people on it. And it'll get to a point where the biggest offenders as far as polluting the atmosphere is concerned will be outside the control of organizations like the IPCC.
Indeed.
And really, it'll be a case of international relations and lobbying other countries to try and do something about peeing in the well.
Yes, up and coming countries like China. I mean, the environment is not a priority for them.
Yeah, they don't seem to be too concerned about the environment. I heard a report this morning on the radio that they have used more concrete in the last 10 years than America has used in the last 100.
Really?
Building all of their ghost cities in the middle of nowhere. And, they're really headed towards a major economic recession that is going to be really interesting to watch. They could really destroy the whole planet's economy fairly considerably when it happens. But they are standing at the precipice right now in terms of their economy. And if their economy goes down, of course, then it doesn't look good for their consideration of the environment.
I'm saying it's just that
we have a lot of failed states. We have a lot of problem countries. And the climate is certainly not high up on their priorities. But there are a lot of organizations that are doing a lot of good and trying to raise awareness of the potential catastrophe of global warming in the not too distant future. And a couple of the good ones are the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. They do an awful lot of work in the United States to try and raise awareness and to try and implement limits to the amount of pollution that can be pumped into the atmosphere. There's the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which again is a highly academic organization where they just want to build the best possible statistics to help make governmental decisions on climate activities. There's the Carbon Brief. This is a website that's really good, and it just fact checks all articles. So whenever there's an article on the climate change in the media, a Carbon Brief will produce an article on that article and just criticizing or applauding the use of science. And then there's a Science Media Center. This is another service that's available on the web, and they help journalists. If you want to write an article about climate change or any scientific topic, really, you can go to the Science Media Center and they'll check over your work and make sure you really are representing the scientific community properly, which is a fantastic resource that it certainly seems as though very few journalists know about, unfortunately. And I think we should move on to the media, because, of course, everything that we know about climate change and global warming comes from the media. And as we know, the media is a bumpy landscape, and media outlets typically have an agenda. So how do you think we've been consuming the climate change story through the media?
What do you mean?
Do you think we're getting the straight dope? Or do you think because of their very adversarial nature, really, they're only interested in sparks and heat?
I think it depends where we're getting it from. I mean, in the rare times that I've watched Fox News, I'm sure they would take the stance that they probably outright deny climate change is happening and that kind of thing. I think the BBC would almost certainly take the stance that obviously climate change is happening. Yeah, I'm sure we are getting the straight dope from mainstream news organizations.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because, as I've said, I don't read scientific papers. Most people don't. We really aren't building stories ourselves simply by looking at the data. So we really do need to, in the first instance, defer to the specialists. We defer to the experts. I'll listen to the scientists. If all the climate change scientists are saying, look, we have a real problem here, I'm going to take them seriously and think, well, you're the experts. What is this problem and what can we do? I may then subsequently ignore them or not want to think about it and just forget everything that they've said. But at least they're the experts, right? So it's important to listen to what they're saying. Anybody who tries to override their expertise is already fighting a losing battle. And the media, the way the media work is that they are sensationalists because they're operating in a commercial environment. So, they want controversy and they want debate, as well as they want the facts and they want the story. So, you do just have to pick and choose and get all of your information from as many outlets as possible. The BBC, for instance, as we've discussed on a previous show, have an interesting relationship with being fair and balanced. I mean, they have a very, at least sometimes, you could charge them with having a too black and white view on a balanced perspective. So, for instance, they may have somebody on an interview show who represents the vast majority of opinion and has a pile of evidence to support his arguments. But then, for the sake of balance, they'll have an opposing view from someone who has no evidence whatsoever and is just
given just as much
maintaining his own claims, and he has absolutely no credibility whatsoever in the community, and yet he's given the same amount of time. So these are two people or two viewpoints that do not have an equal weight, and yet are given the same amount of time. So it's a tricky situation for the BBC to be in, or any broadcaster or media outlet. It isn't fair and balanced, and yet you can understand how they might think it's fair and balanced. Their point of view is that they are providing an alternate view.
It's funny.
You can't just hear everything this person says. We need to have an alternate view, but that alternate view is so incredible.
Yeah, that also goes back to what we're talking about. Well, what I was talking about the analogy with evolution deniers, because the lobbyists for climate change denying want it to be taught in schools, both sides of the story. Again, making it seem as if there are two schools of thought here, and both are somehow just as scientifically legitimate, which is complete crap. So yeah, that's just, similar to how the BBC would approach this, I'm sure.
Well, I mean, the BBC are aware of this issue uh, from complaints. They've fielded thousands of complaints on their fair and balanced approach as per their mandate, and in fact commissioned a study and a report from a leading scientist, Professor Steve Jones, who does the rounds on the BBC quite often. He's particularly frequent as a guest on In Our Time on Radio 4. He's a geneticist. I've read quite a few of his books. He's a very populist scientist. And I quote, he says, quoting from The Guardian, "This goes to the heart of science reporting. You wouldn't have a homeopath speaking alongside a brain surgeon for balance, as that would be absurd. It's just as absurd to have a climate skeptic for balance against the work of the overwhelming majority of climate scientists." Which is true. The amount of evidence is overwhelming. It's just, there is no controversy. The deniers are increasingly looking like total wingnuts, unfortunately. Now, there are aspects of the climate science for global warming that are questionable, but that's simply a question of more evidence is required. And the evidence is always coming in. They're always refining the studies. They're always gathering more data. So, so far, like any scientific study, they're trying to prove otherwise, but it's just not happening. Everything falls in line with the predicted extrapolation of the current trend, which is not looking good. So it's difficult. It's always difficult to have a fair and balanced view on any scientific claims when they consider such a large amount of information, and it's can be open to interpretation. It's very difficult, especially for lay people. I look out the window and it's cold. We had snow this year, or it's because of the human timescales. It's very hard to see these long-term changes. You're trying to see the movement in the growth of fingernails. It's incredibly hard. So we have to depend on abstract outlooks and the advice of the experts and interpretations of the data. But it's so easy not to think about it. Similarly, it's easy not to think about the suffering of humans in other countries. You can read about famines and terrible suffering that's going on, but because you don't share a nervous system with the people who are suffering, you are not immediately affected by it. So, you really need to be sold on being affected by it. And I think climate change and global warming falls in that sort of zone. It's a domain of the future, which is easy to put on the back burner and is very, very easy to fall away and not have anything to do with at all. So I think there's a moral dimension to this. I mean, if, let's, for sake of argument, say climate change is significantly moving towards global warming, and the reason why it is doing this is because of human activity, it's continuing, and it's going to get to a breaking point where we have major weather problems leading to famines, crop failures, displacement, and starvation. So, in terms of morality, what should we do? What are we doing? And where are we on the moral compass currently? Are we all evil?
Well, I think the people who are standing in the way of progress and muddying the waters and doing all the bad things, the a-holes, I think there is a kind of moral component to that. It's what I was saying earlier. It's a lack of compassion. It's real selfishness of the worst kind. God, it's terrible.
But is it a problem that we can see? Is this a sort of cognitive dissonance in that we can say the words that we are destroying the future for our, grandchildren, but we don't change our habits or the way in which we conduct ourselves on the
It,
planet.
it probably is a human nature thing.
But that's the bystander effect. So you could have a huge crowd of people and a crime could be committed and nobody intervenes because everybody's looking at everybody else and thinking, well, nobody's intervening, so I'm not going to intervene. The larger the group of people, the less likely it is for a particular individual to intervene in a crime, for instance. So this is a huge crime that everybody's perpetrating. We're destroying our future. But no single no single individual or organization is making a major move to try and stop this from happening and to shake us all and say, look, wake up.
Yes, it's very similar to genocidal neglect, where if it's one person, I'll help this person. If it's thousands,
Yeah.
millions, it's like, oh,
Yeah, it's
not
definitely a
interested.
weird one. I mean, how do we motivate people? The Jews refused to believe the Holocaust was happening when it was happening. They simply refused to believe it. There's just no way this would be allowed. There are laws. It's not possible. It was possible. You may think it's not possible to destroy the Earth. There are cosmic laws preventing it. No, there aren't. It is possible. We can do it, and we are doing it. So, what can we do about it?
I did think it's hard to believe at all.
Well, for some people, perhaps.
Unless you have a dog in the fight, I think it's pretty easy to get your head around. I mean, the argument made earlier about how many CO2s we're pumping into the atmosphere. I mean, how many cars are there in the United States, for example? And we were talking about the Koch brothers. I was reading some little factoid about how their business in their businesses, like in a year, will pump out the same as 5 million cars pump out in a year, or something along those lines. And as I say, I don't think it takes much of imagination to imagine what that looks like and to see quite clearly that we're doing some harm here.
Yeah, the Koch brothers certainly have a vested interest in keeping the oil industry going and not having any, ridiculously draconian tax laws preventing them from growth. For sure. So the lobbyists are powerful. There are a lot of anonymous donors, especially in the United States, who give an awful lot of money to the government, senators and parties and what have you, in order that they continue down the fossil fuel line. But even so, I mean, an awful lot of an absolutely horrific amount of gas goes into the atmosphere, which is detrimental to life and has a pronounced effect on the biosphere. But so, what are the solutions? I mean, it seems to me that we can simply reduce our consumption of fossil fuels, and to me, that just seems absolutely not going to happen. The idea of reducing anything or reducing growth, it's crazy. It's not going to happen. We want growth. We want growth.
I disagree with that. I think there might be some kind of I don't know, some kind of raising awareness of just the cost of burning fossil fuels. I mean, not just in terms of environmental, but I just mean in terms of an ethical cost. Like, for example, the United States putting up with the kinds of crap that Saudi Arabia does. And the reason being is that, we want their oil. So we don't want to upset them, so them, flogging bloggers or whatever. I think if more and more people sort of realize that that's not cricket, there might be more of an incentive to kind of try and move away from oil, so we have a little bit more leverage with countries like Saudi Arabia and their appalling human rights records.
It's true. But I think our dependence on fossil fuels and the horrible regimes that give us access to the fossil fuels is such that we'd be stunned and horrified to learn the facts and the extent to our dependence. I think I always get the impression that Obama, before he became president, he seemed really quite liberal in terms of what he's going to stop. He's going to shut down Guantanamo Bay. He's gonna make so many social changes, and climate related changes. It'll blow your mind. But as soon as he became president and he got that special security briefing and learned how frightening the world really is and just how incredibly dependent we, the brave, are on the resources found under the ground in other countries, I think he kind of moved back a little bit. Because I think we are horrifically dependent on destroying the planet. If anybody is gonna save us, it's not going to be somebody who can instill some sort of social and cultural change in the way we behave in terms of energy. I think it's going to be a straight up technological solution. I think the firms who are trying to work out the best way to remove excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and the firms that are building new technologies to generate energy cleanly, this is the way. So it is not having to adapt to a new climate, rather redefining that climate and rebuilding that climate to continue to suit us in the best possible way. So I think it probably is a mistake to really clamp down on individual companies in terms of taxation and stifling their innovation. I think, if you're going to be anti-statist, I think the best argument you have is let's let innovation happen and let companies flourish, because the only way in which we're going to save ourselves from destroying the planet is to develop technologies which prevent us from suffocating. So either we get off the planet or we clean up the atmosphere. And I think we'll continue to enjoy the energy that we're enjoying, and it'll continue to increase. And we're going, all the boats are rising as the tide rises. But we simply need to install filters on our lungs in order to clean the air. And I think that's what has to happen. So I want to see huge investments from the governments and, big announcements from the IPCC to say there are concerted efforts in order to build these technologies that are going to help us out. This should be a real grand challenge, grand scientific challenge, they call them. So, similar to the development of nuclear energy and the moonshot and the development of radio telescopes, that sort of thing, where there is a big concerted effort to get these technologies off the ground. This should be happening for clearing the air. I was reading with interest how the Californians are investing heavily in desalination plants in order to get some water because they don't have any. And they've just, I think they just ramped up to full production, the largest desalination plant in the world in somewhere in California. I've forgotten. The Mojave, maybe near the Mojave Desert. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that should be this state's priority, desalination. It just beggars belief that there's such a huge coastline with all those billions of acres of blue water just not doing anything. And here we are suffering in a drought.
It's crazy. That is exactly one of those things where I cannot fathom why there isn't such a greater effort in that direction.
It might be Koch brother lobbying for some stupid reason. Who knows?
Now, I was speaking to somebody the other week who had a 13-year-old Mercedes, and it has a roof covered in solar panels. And what it does is that when your car is parked in a car park that's been baking in the hot sun all day and you open the door, it's not a furnace because those solar panels have been helping turn fans that circulate air in the cabin. No brainer. That was 13 years ago. Why isn't every car coated in solar panels to do exactly that? So you save on the energy on your air conditioning units and your fans and all of that, which burns your fuel, and use the sun. Cars are a natural candidate for solar panels, as far as I can see. That just doesn't happen. I never see that.
It's weird.
Why are Tesla cars not covered in solar panels? It makes you could trickle charge those cars.
Here in Southern California, it's like sunny all the time. The sun is just always out, and you'd think there would be more solar solar panels. Interestingly enough, if you drive in the countryside, there are a lot more wind farms than there are in the UK. It's like wind, yeah. Maybe solar power, still has a way to go before it becomes not self-defeating. Who knows?
Yeah, I think it'll be a combination of so-called renewables. I think our best bet to reduce our carbon footprint as a species is nuclear energy still. That is the number one best bet.
Yeah, but
But
there
that
are
could be
concerns with that.
overtaken by a combination approach of other renewable technologies.
Yeah, but there's still nuclear technology in that way is being held back just from public concern. People are just not comfortable with the whole idea of a nuclear power station.
Well, again, it's cutting edge technology, and it's difficult for the man in the street to understand. But they have reactors now that are so safe and so efficient, like the fast breeder reactors that I think we've spoken about before in a previous show, and the efficiency levels are absolutely vast. The initial capital expenditure on these projects is vast. I mean, just mind-blowingly high because of all the safety concerns and the efficiency gains and all the rest of it, and the technology, and the complexity. But once they're in, it really does produce very clean energy indeed. So I think more investment in nuclear energy, more investment in clever technologies. So these are lightweight, low cost, trickle charge type energy solutions, including solar arrays, especially in hot countries where the sun is always out. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, it's as obvious to me as having a hat that has a built-in fan and a solar panel on the top. The sunnier and hotter it is, the faster that fan spins to cool your face. That's the sort of thing we want. It's ridiculous that we are allowing solar energy to go straight through our atmosphere, warming it up as it goes through it, and then hitting the dirt. Complete wasted trip. It just spent 93 million miles of travel time, and it just hit the ground doing nothing except warming up the atmosphere. That's just diabolical, and I think something must be done there. And it is. There are large solar farms. There's the concentrator solar farms that are just mirrors that focus on a central boiler, effectively. And then you have the solar farms, which I'm seeing more of, especially in this country, in the countryside. Entire crop fields have been given up for solar arrays. It's an amazing sight. You just what on earth is that? If you approach the field in the right angle, you don't know what you're looking at. It looks like it's a reservoir. Then you realize, no, wait a minute, it's thousands of solar panels, which is great. They're contributing energy back to the national grid, selling it back to the national grid, and it's clean. There's no poison gases. And again, cars, it just, most cars that you look at have an exhaust pipe in the back, and what do you think is coming out of the exhaust pipe? It's carbon dioxide mostly, and that's exactly what gives us the global warming that we're trying to reduce. So those cars need to be electric. They need to be hydrogen, even. Whatever it is that's coming out of the back of them, you don't want it to be carbon dioxide. But having said that, of course, the lungs of the planet, the plants, that is their ambrosia. So, carbon dioxide is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just an excess amount of carbon dioxide is a bad thing. Like anything in excess, that's what toxicity is. And if we have too much carbon dioxide, which we seem to be developing, we're heading into major problems. So solutions are alternative energy types, general technology for perhaps filtering and cleaning the air, or reducing our consumption. But that one I just don't see happening. Just reducing anything just seems crazy to me, but it's a possibility. I mean, I always turn off the lights when I walk out of a room. It's reflex. I was brought up that way. I don't know about you, but I can't seem to leave a room with lights blazing. Even if they're low energy bulbs, I don't care. I turn the light off.
We were probably brought up the same way, Jeff.
I think you're probably right there. But I think we've covered everything. Is there anything else you think we should cover in terms of climate change?
I think that's fine. I think that's good. I think we covered everything that we can.
Well, that's good. Well, you've been listening to Eclecticist the podcast, all of our shows and this show and our show notes that we publish. And if you want to contact us, you can fill out the contact form, all found on our website, eclecticist.co.uk. Next time, we haven't decided what we'll be speaking about, so if you have any ideas, please send them along to us. Our music of choice as our outro this time is, again, something open source and free to use for non-commercial purposes, so we don't get sued. And it is music called Earth versus the World. It's by the Polish Ambassador. They are purveyors of fine glitch and trip-hop music, and this was from the Free Music Archive. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. The topic of our next show will be published on our site. Thank you very much, and good night.